Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything. Welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen Schmucker, and we are in Luke 19 today. As a reminder, I'm using the Behold Studies from the Daily Grace Co., as well as the free reading plan, and you can find all the information about those in the show notes. We have talked a lot about tax collectors in the past few chapters, and today we are introduced to Zacchaeus, who is the chief tax collector. From what we know about tax collectors, we can surmise that he had likely not gotten this position due to his integrity. And yet, we are introduced to Zacchaeus, and he wants to see Jesus. He wanted so badly to behold Jesus that he was willing to climb up a tree and act very undignified for a man in his position. But as much as Zacchaeus wanted Jesus, Jesus wanted him more. Jesus called him by name, and then Jesus told him that he would come to his home that day. We shouldn't be too surprised that the crowds complain because Jesus is again having a meal with a sinner. Zacchaeus repented and paid back those he had wronged, and the reminder that rang from Jesus' lips was that he had come to save the lost. The next parable that Jesus tells is the parable of the 10 minas. Interestingly, many scholars have noticed that these events are similar to the leader Archelaus, who would have been well known at the time, but above all, this is a display of Jesus' kingship. Archelaus was a man who went away, was then appointed king, and then returned, similar to the trajectory of Jesus' life. This parable begs us to ask ourselves the question, how should God's people live while waiting for his return? The parable is about the treasure of the gospel going out to the world. The gospel has the power to grow, but God has also asked us to steward it well. In this parable, we see that 2 of the servants invested what had been entrusted to them, and 1 hid and blamed his master. The 3rd servant lived in fear and apathy, but that is not what followers of Jesus are called to do. Our King is kind and gracious. He wants us to live faithful lives that invest in things of eternal value. The chapter then moves us to the triumphal entry. This is the event that Christians celebrate on Palm Sunday each year. Though Luke's gospel does not specifically mention the palms, this is the start of what is typically referred to as Passion Week or Holy Week. Jesus was still approaching Jerusalem when he told 2 of the disciples to go into the village where they would find a donkey. If anyone asked, they were to tell them that the Lord needed it. Perhaps Jesus had already asked the owner, or perhaps he just knew. We see here the humility of Christ, who came to earth as a baby, who served the people that rejected him, and who rode on a borrowed animal that he had created. But this is exactly what the scriptures had prophesied would happen. In Zechariah 9:9 we read, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." It was almost Passover, and people were pouring into Jerusalem on pilgrimages, and yet they were completely unaware of all that was to take place. The disciples were the first to praise Jesus as they took off their cloaks and laid them down as a makeshift saddle. The ground was lined with palm branches in their cloaks, and it became a red carpet of sorts as the people adored the Messiah. The crowd proclaimed the words of Psalm 118:26 as they said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And they echoed the song that the angels had proclaimed at Jesus' birth when they said, "Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Yet the Pharisees refused to join in. What a typical response this is of the Pharisees to Jesus. But the section ends with a reminder from Jesus that if the people did not praise him, the rocks would cry out in worship. As Jesus approached the city, he wept. Jesus wept because he knew that the praise would soon be turned to shouts of "Crucify him." And he prophesied of what would happen in AD 70 when Jerusalem would be destroyed. And yet we cannot miss the compassion of Jesus. We see it here, but we have seen it on every page of the Gospels. Jesus then went into the temple and threw out those who had made it a marketplace. These tradespeople had set up shop in the court of the Gentiles, which meant that the Gentiles were being excluded from worship. These people had prioritized their own selfish gain over the worship of the people they viewed as outsiders. Jesus taught in the temple, but the situation was quickly escalating. The chief priests were looking for a way to kill him because of how captivated the people that encountered him were. Today we behold Jesus as the one who pursues us and calls us by name. He isn't afraid to be with sinners, and that means he isn't afraid to be with us. We see him as our King and the one who calls us to live lives that will matter for eternity. We behold him as the humble Messiah, the blessed King who comes to meet us and who deserves all the praise of heaven. We see him as the God who weeps and who pours out his compassion on us. We see him as the embodiment of justice who always does what is right and who cares for those that are marginalized. We see him as the worthy one who is worthy of all the worship of every human heart and of all creation.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.